The worst mistake the Dominion ever made was believing humanity would die quietly. The first ship appeared over Ethon Prime at 6:14 in the evening, just as the city lights were beginning to wake beneath the rain clouds. At first, people thought it was a shadow from the storm front rolling in from the Western Ocean. Then the stars disappeared one by one. Traffic slowed across the upper transit lanes. Pedestrians stopped in the streets and tilted their heads upward. The massive object hanging above the Capitol was too large for the mind to accept immediately. It stretched nearly 3 miles across the sky, a black shape without markings, without signals, without any of the glowing diplomatic colors recognized by the Dominion Fleet Registry. It simply hovered there in total silence. Then another ship emerged beside it. Then another. By 6:23, the entire western sky was gone. Lyra's son stood frozen outside the Senate Archives building with her data tablet hanging limp in one hand while cold rain mist drifted across the marble steps around her. She was 24 years old, junior administrative aide to the Dominion High Council. And until that moment, the most frightening thing she had ever experienced was accidentally speaking out of turn in front of a senior minister. Now thousands of people stood shoulder to shoulder across the Capital District, staring upward in absolute silence, while a dead civilization blocked out the stars. The humans had returned. No one spoke the words aloud at first. No one needed to. The shape of the ships alone told the story. Human vessels had always looked different from Dominion engineering. Alien warships were elegant, curved, almost artistic in their construction. Human ships had always looked industrial, functional, built by a species more concerned with surviving than impressing anyone. These new ships looked worse. Heavy, scarred. Their surfaces carried no decorative plating, no ceremonial lights, no polished symmetry. They looked like weapons that had outlived the people who built them. Somewhere behind Lyra, a man whispered a prayer. Another person began crying softly. Across the avenue, the giant public holoscreen above the financial district flickered once before every advertisement vanished simultaneously. Static rolled across the display for 3 seconds. Then a single image appeared, the old Terran emblem, white against a black field. The symbol had not been seen publicly in over 2 decades. A low sound spread through the crowd. Not panic yet, something quieter and far more dangerous. Recognition. 22 years earlier, during the final winter of the border wars, the Terran coalition fleets had vanished beyond the Perseus dead zones after the collapse of the Vega Gates. Official records claimed humanity had been destroyed during the retreat. The Dominion government had declared the species functionally extinct 12 years later. Schools stopped teaching Terran history. Memorials fell apart. Entire generations grew up believing humans were simply another failed civilization swallowed by war. But older people remembered. Older people remembered the final transmission. Lyra remembered it too, though she had only been a child when she first saw the recording in a history archive. A damaged Terran admiral standing on the bridge of a burning ship. Smoke behind him. Emergency lights flickering red across exhausted faces. His voice calm despite the chaos around him. Dominion Command, he had said, "Our civilian convoys are still inside the corridor. We are requesting immediate extraction clearance." Then silence. 43 seconds of silence before the transmission ended. No rescue fleet ever came. Above the Capitol, one of the enormous human ships slowly rotated in the clouds. Massive engine lights glowed faint blue through the rain like distant artificial moons. Lyra realized her hands were shaking. Around her, every public communication channel in the city suddenly went dark. No advertisements, no news, no emergency broadcasts, only static. Then a voice finally emerged from every speaker across Ethon Prime. Deep, calm, human. This is Fleet Command of the Terran Sovereignty. The rain continued falling across the silent city. "Remain where you are," the voice said. "Humanity has come to collect what was taken from us." For 11 minutes after the transmission, nobody inside the Dominion Senate moved. The High Council chamber sat beneath the central tower of Ethon Prime. wrapped in silver walls and cold white light that suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour earlier. Senior ministers whispered behind raised hands while military advisors stared silently at tactical displays that refused to make sense. Fleet signatures continued appearing beyond the atmosphere every 30 seconds. 100 ships, then 140. Then over 200 confirmed contacts spread across orbital space in perfect formation without a single collision warning or communication error. Human coordination had once been considered primitive compared to Dominion battle networking. Now, their formations moved with the precision of machinery that had spent decades practicing for one single day. Lyra stood near the rear archive station, clutching a stack of untouched reports against her chest, while rainwater slowly dried along the sleeves of her uniform. Nobody had acknowledged her presence since she entered the chamber 20 minutes earlier. That was normal for junior aides. Tonight, she preferred it that way. The room smelled faintly of ozone from overheated tactical consoles. Somewhere above them, the low vibration of orbital defense platforms powering online rolled through the tower floor like distant thunder. "How many confirmed?" Counselor Veyron asked quietly. His voice sounded older than it had that morning. 213 vessels. A naval officer answered without looking up. Possibly more behind Lunar Shadow. Another silence followed. Not disbelief anymore. Calculation. Fear had already settled into the room like smoke. On the far wall, the massive tactical projection of Ethon Prime rotated slowly beneath a growing web of red markers representing Terran fleet positions. Lyra noticed something strange immediately. The humans had not targeted civilian sectors. They had not positioned warships over population centers. Every ship sat above infrastructure. Orbital elevators, trade routes, defense satellites, communication arrays. They were not threatening the planet. They were controlling it. "Open a diplomatic channel," one minister finally said. Immediately, the communications officer swallowed visibly before nodding. "Channels are open, sir." And the officer hesitated. "They are not responding." A colder silence followed that answer. 22 years ago, humanity had begged for responses that never came. Lyra felt the realization settle slowly through the chamber as more ministers began understanding the same thing. This was deliberate. Across the tactical display, one section suddenly expanded automatically as a new image entered Dominion sensor range. A single Terran flagship descending through the upper atmosphere directly toward the Senate district. The vessel moved slowly, almost respectfully, but its sheer size made the motion feel overwhelming. Nearly a mile long, dark gray, carrying no decorative lighting except for narrow white strips near the engine housing. Old damage scars remained visible across parts of the hull, as if the ship had survived wounds too expensive or too meaningful to repair. The identification code appeared moments later. TSS Vigilance. Lyra heard one of the older ministers inhale sharply. "That ship was destroyed at Vega Corridor," he whispered. Nobody answered him, because everyone in the room suddenly remembered Vega Corridor, the final battle of the border wars, the last known human stand. Official records described it as a tragic strategic collapse caused by failed retreat logistics during a coordinated enemy advance. But rumors had survived longer than official reports. Rumors that Terran fleets had been left behind intentionally while Dominion forces escaped through collapsing jump gates. Rumors that civilian convoys carrying thousands of human families never received evacuation clearance. Rumors that some transmissions had been sealed permanently by the High Council itself. Lyra looked around the chamber and realized something that frightened her more than the fleet outside. None of the senior counselors looked surprised anymore. Guilty people rarely looked surprised when the past finally arrived at their door. Suddenly, every screen in the Senate chamber flickered black at once. The tactical maps vanished. The council seal disappeared. Then a human face appeared across every display in the room. An older man, mid-50s perhaps. Short gray hair, pale eyes, deep lines carved into a face that looked less angry than exhausted. He wore a dark Terran uniform with no medals visible anywhere on the collar or chest. Behind him stretched the dim bridge of a massive warship where dozens of silent officers worked beneath cold blue lighting. The man looked directly into the camera for several seconds before speaking. "My name is Admiral Adrian Cross," he said calmly. 22 years ago, your government abandoned my people at Vega Corridor." Nobody in the chamber moved. Adrian Cross folded his hands behind his back. "Tonight," he continued softly, "we would like to discuss repayment." Adrian Cross did not look like the monster the Dominion had spent 20 years warning itself about. That unsettled Lyra more than anger would have. He stood motionless on the bridge of the Vigilance while soft blue light moved across the steel walls behind him and human officers worked in total silence at their stations. No shouting, no celebration, no visible hatred. Only discipline so controlled it felt unnatural. The camera angle widened slightly, revealing part of the bridge observation window behind Adrian. Ethon Prime hung there beneath the warship like a glowing marble wrapped in storm clouds. "You are occupying sovereign Dominion space," Counselor Varen said carefully from the center of the Senate chamber. His voice carried the strained calm of a man, trying not to show fear in front of people equally afraid. "If your intention is negotiation, then threatening a civilian capital is not the way to begin." Adrian listened without interruption. When Varen finished, the human admiral lowered his eyes briefly as though considering whether the statement deserved a response at all. 22 years ago, Adrian said quietly, the Dominion's 7th Fleet requested Terran support during the retreat at Vega Corridor. His voice remained calm, almost tired. "Human carriers moved into defensive formation around your evacuation routes, while your civilian transports escaped through the jump gates." A faint movement passed through the Senate chamber. Older ministers avoided eye contact. The agreement guaranteed extraction clearance for Terran civilian convoys once the Dominion withdrawal was complete, Adrian continued. That clearance never arrived. The tactical screens behind the counselors suddenly activated without permission. Old footage filled the walls of the chamber. Grainy recordings, damaged transmission logs, human ships drifting through dark space beneath emergency lighting while warning sirens echoed faintly in the background. Lyra felt cold immediately. These were classified archives. Some had supposedly been erased decades earlier. A younger version of Adrian Cross appeared on one screen, wearing a scorched naval jacket with exhaustion written deep into his face. "Dominion Command," the younger Adrian repeated through static. "We still have 14 civilian carriers trapped inside Corridor 9. We are requesting immediate gate access." Silence answered him. Another transmission followed 90 seconds later. Then another. Human officers moving through dim corridors, carrying frightened children wrapped in emergency blankets. Engineers working with shaking hands beside failing reactor systems. Ordinary people waiting for instructions that never came. The Dominion fleet had enough power remaining to reopen the gates, Adrian said softly in the present. Your government chose not to. That is not proven, another minister interrupted sharply. The collapse at Vega was chaotic. Communications failures. Adrian raised one hand slightly. Every screen in the chamber changed again. This time the footage showed an internal Dominion transmission stamped with High Council authorization codes. A council chamber. Panic. Military advisors speaking over one another while casualty projections rotated above the table. Then a sentence appeared in bright white text across the center display. Prioritize Dominion Ochet. Terran losses accepted. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Lyra looked slowly around the room. Nobody protested the authenticity of the order. Nobody even looked surprised anymore. Counselor Varen sat perfectly still with both hands gripping the edge of the podium so tightly his knuckles had turned pale blue beneath the chamber lights. 6 million Terran civilians were abandoned inside collapsing sectors, Adrian said. Families, colonies transport, medical ships, children. His expression never changed while he spoke. That frightened Lyra more than rage ever could have. And afterward, Adrian continued, your government informed the galaxy humanity had died heroically beside its allies. One of the ministers finally found his voice. "What exactly do you want from us?" Adrian looked directly into the camera for the first time since the transmission began. Pale eyes, exhausted eyes, the eyes of a man who had carried the same memory for 22 years without ever setting it down. "Tonight," he said quietly. "Nothing violent." Behind him, another Terran warship descended slowly through the clouds over Ethon Prime. Its enormous shadow rolled across the Senate Tower windows like an approaching storm. Adrian folded his hands behind his back again. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin discussing surrender." The rain over Ethon Prime did not stop that night. It rolled across the capital in cold silver sheets while 200 human warships remained motionless above the clouds like dark islands suspended in the sky. Curfew spread through the city before midnight. Transit rails shut down. Restaurants emptied early. Families gathered around silent hollow screens, waiting for updates that never came. The Dominion government controlled nearly every information network in known space. Yet somehow humanity had seized the entire planetary communications grid in less than an hour without firing a single shot. That frightened people more than open warfare would have. Lyra's son sat alone inside archive room, 12 beneath soft overhead lights, while old classified files scrolled silently across the terminal in front of her. Outside the narrow window beside her desk, she could see one of the Terran ships hanging above the city through layers of rain and fog. It had not moved in 4 hours. Neither had she. The file she was reading carried level black clearance. Accessing it without authorization could have ended her career that morning. Tonight, nobody seemed to care anymore. Half the Senate staff had already evacuated to secure districts beneath the lower towers. The other half wandered the halls pretending they still had jobs to do. Lyra stared at the date stamped across the report. 22 years earlier. Vega Corridor Evacuation Review. Her throat tightened slightly as she continued reading. The official public version of the battle had always described humanity as brave allies lost during an unavoidable retreat collapse. The internal reports told a different story entirely. Dominion analysts had calculated Terran casualty projections before the evacuation even began. They knew human fleets positioned at the rear defense line would not escape in time once the jump gates destabilized. They knew millions of civilians remained trapped inside convoy routes. And still the order had gone forward. Strategic necessity, the documents called it. Acceptable losses. Probability management. Cold phrases written by people who had never looked frightened families in the eyes while abandoning them to darkness. Lyra leaned back slowly in her chair and rubbed her hands together for warmth. The archive levels were always cold after midnight. She realized suddenly that she had stopped seeing the humans as invaders sometime during the last hour. Not heroes, not victims, something more unsettling than either. Survivors. The room lights flickered once. Then her terminal screen went black. Lyra sat upright immediately. A second later, new text appeared across the display in plain white letters. "You should not be reading those files alone." Her heartbeat jumped hard enough to hurt. She glanced around the empty archive room before typing carefully onto the console. "Who is this?" The response appeared almost instantly. Someone who spent 22 years wondering if anyone in the Dominion would ever look. Lyra stared at the words while cold unease settled into her stomach. Terran access. Inside the Senate archives. Inside restricted government systems. Another line appeared beneath the first. "Did they tell you about the children?" Lyra swallowed. Before she could answer, several images opened automatically. Across the screen, human evacuation footage. Families crowded into damaged carriers beneath failing emergency lights. Children sleeping on corridor floors wrapped in silver thermal blankets. Medical officers handing out water ration packets with tired hands. Ordinary people waiting calmly because they still believed someone was coming back for them. Lyra felt something heavy settle in her chest. One image remained on the screen longer than the others. A young Terran officer kneeling beside two little girls near a carrier window while reading from a paper storybook under dim battery light. The girls could not have been older than 6 or 7. The timestamp on the image showed it was recorded 4 hours after the Dominion withdrawal order. For hours after the gates had already closed. Lyra looked down at the officer's face and froze. Younger. Dark hair instead of gray. Less tired around the eyes. But unmistakable. Adrian Cross. Another message appeared slowly beneath the image. He stayed with them until the lights went out. Lyra stared at the screen in silence while rain tapped softly against the archive window behind her. Then the terminal flickered one final time before displaying a single sentence. Tomorrow the galaxy learns what your government did to US. By morning the entire galaxy had seen the files. Dominion servers failed one after another under the weight of millions of unauthorized downloads as sealed wartime archives spread across civilian networks faster than government firewalls could contain them. Every major trade hub, every colony world, every independent station from the inner systems to the frontier sectors woke to the same recordings playing across public screens. Human convoys stranded in dark space. Desperate evacuation requests unanswered. Internal Dominion orders labeling Terran civilians as acceptable strategic losses. For 22 years, the Dominion had controlled the story. Overnight, that story collapsed. Lyra stepped out of the Senate archives shortly after sunrise into a capital city that no longer felt stable beneath her feet. Crowds had gathered across the lower plazas despite emergency restrictions. Thousands of civilians stood in silence watching enormous hollow screens mounted above the transit towers while leaked Vega footage replayed over and over again. Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted. The mood felt heavier than outrage. It felt like collective shame settling slowly over an entire civilization. Above the city, the Terran fleet remained perfectly still beneath pale morning clouds. The ships looked even larger in daylight. Cold, gray metal stretched across the sky in impossible shapes that blocked sunlight from entire districts. Yet no weapons had been fired. No demands had been broadcast beyond Adrian Cross's simple statement from the night before. Humanity had not returned like conquerors from old war dramas. They had returned like accountants arriving to collect unpaid debt. That terrified people in ways panic never could. Lyra crossed the plaza carefully through clusters of civilians speaking in low, uncertain voices. She overheard fragments everywhere she passed. They left them there. 6 million civilians. The files are authentic. How did the humans survive? An elderly man near the fountain stared upward at the fleet with pale, unfocused eyes and whispered something that made Lyra slow her pace. We thought silence meant weakness. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, every screen across Ethon Prime flickered simultaneously. Conversations stopped instantly. Adrian Cross appeared once again, standing on the bridge of the Vigilance in the same dark uniform, his expression calm and unreadable beneath the cold blue lights of the command deck. Behind him, human officers continued, working quietly, without looking toward the camera. 22 years ago, Adrian began, the Terran coalition ceased to exist. His voice carried across the entire city. No anger, no raised emotion, just exhaustion sharpened into discipline. Our worlds burned. Our governments collapsed. Our fleets vanished into sectors the Dominion considered uninhabitable. Images appeared beside him across the broadcast. Frozen asteroid belts transformed into industrial shipyards. Mining colonies carved into dead moons. Children studying inside narrow steel classrooms beneath artificial lights. Human workers assembling. Massive warships inside hollowed asteroids while snow drifted through damaged construction bays. You believed humanity disappeared, Adrian continued. In truth, humanity adapted. More footage followed. Terran settlements hidden inside radiation storms. Families farming beneath underground sun lamps. Engineers repairing failing life support systems with improvised machinery held together by determination more than resources. Humans surviving not because conditions improved, but because they refused to stop surviving. Lyra felt her throat tighten unexpectedly while watching the images. None of it looked glorious. None of it looked triumphant. It looked cold, lonely, Exhausting. For 22 years, Adrian said softly, we rebuilt ourselves in the dark while the Dominion erased us from history. His eyes lifted slightly toward the camera. We did not return for revenge. Across the capital, people listened in complete silence. Revenge ends when anger fades, Adrian continued. We return because civilizations that betray their allies eventually betray everyone. The screen shifted again, this time displaying a formal list of demands. Dissolution of the High War Council. Transfer of all strategic gate systems into Terran oversight. Full release of sealed wartime archives. Public trials for surviving officials involved in the Vega withdrawal order. Gasps spread quietly through the plaza around Lyra as civilians read the terms. Humanity was not asking for territory, not demanding tribute. They were dismantling Dominion control itself. Adrian folded his hand behind his back once more. You believed abandoning us would secure your future, he said. Instead, it created us. Then the broadcast ended. Above Ethon Prime, the silent fleet remained motionless beneath the morning sky while, for the first time in generations, the Dominion realized humanity had not returned asking to be heard. Humanity had returned already knowing it could not be ignored. The Dominion Senate convened under emergency session at noon, though by then everyone understood the word emergency no longer meant what it used to. The chamber that once controlled half the known systems now felt strangely small beneath the shadow of the Terran fleet overhead. Ministers sat in rigid silence around the silver council ring, while tactical projections hovered untouched above the central floor. Nobody discussed military options anymore. That conversation had ended sometime during the night when analysts confirmed the horrifying truth. Humanity controlled every major gate surrounding the capital, every trade lane, every communications relay. Without firing a shot, they had wrapped the Dominion in chains made entirely from infrastructure. Lyra stood once again near the rear archive station, watching older politicians age visibly by the minute beneath the cold chamber lights. Councillor Varen looked exhausted. The deep blue skin beneath his eyes had darkened overnight, and his hands trembled slightly each time he reached for another report. Across the chamber, several military advisors argued quietly about fleet positioning, but their voices carried the hollow tone of people discussing procedures that no longer mattered. How did they build this? One admiral whispered in disbelief while studying the Terran fleet formations rotating slowly above the tactical display. 200 capital ships hidden for 2 decades without detection. Another officer answered without lifting his eyes from the screen. Not hidden, ignored. That silence afterward felt painfully honest. For years, the Dominion had treated humanity as a failed species. Scattered survivors. Refugees clinging to forgotten colonies near dead space. No one had considered the possibility that silence itself could become camouflage. The chamber doors opened suddenly. Every head turned instinctively. A Dominion security officer hurried inside, carrying a sealed data slate against his chest with the tense posture of someone transporting dangerous material. He crossed directly to Councillor Varen and whispered something quietly enough that Lyra could not hear it. Whatever was said drained the remaining color from the councillor's face. Put on the screen, Varen said finally. The officer hesitated. Sir, are you certain? Now. A moment later, new footage appeared above the chamber floor. Human archival. Recordings. But these were different from the evacuation files. These showed the years afterward. The years humanity vanished into darkness. Lyra watched frozen asteroid stations drift silently through endless black while damaged Terran ships docked beneath weak emergency lighting. Families moved through narrow steel corridors wearing patched clothing and carrying ration containers in gloved hands. Children studied beside old reactor pipes because there had been nowhere else warm enough to gather. One clip showed a human woman teaching a classroom of 6-year-olds while frost covered the inside walls behind them. Another showed engineers repairing life support systems with salvage parts while snow drifted through exposed sections of hull plating. Nobody in the footage looked heroic. They looked tired, terribly tired. Yet every image carried the same quiet determination beneath the exhaustion. Survival had become routine for them. These recordings were intercepted from abandoned Terran sectors 6 years ago, the security officer explained softly. The files were archived under low-threat classification. Low threat. Lyra almost laughed hearing the phrase. Across the chamber, older ministers stared at the footage with expressions that slowly shifted from fear into something closer to guilt. They had imagined humanity rebuilding itself through anger. Armies. Propaganda. Hatred. Instead, the recordings showed parents raising children in failing stations while teaching them mathematics beside leaking pipes. Farmers growing vegetables beneath artificial sunlight inside hollowed moons. Mechanics repairing damaged oxygen systems while music played softly in the background from old Terran speakers. Humanity had not survived through rage alone. Humanity had survived because ordinary people refused to let one another disappear. The final recording began automatically, without warning. A younger Adrian Cross stood inside a dim industrial hangar, speaking to a crowd of exhausted civilians wrapped in winter coats and thermal blankets. Snow drifted through cracks in the station ceiling behind him. He looked thinner then, more haunted, but his voice carried the same quiet steadiness Lyra recognized from the broadcasts. "The Dominion believes we are dying," he told them. "Let them believe it." Silence filled the Senate chamber as everyone listened. Adrian looked slowly across the frightened faces surrounding him in the old recording before speaking again. "We survived the war," he said softly. "Now we survive long enough to make them remember us." The footage ended. No one inside the Senate chamber spoke for several seconds afterward. Outside the towering windows behind them, one of the massive Terran ships drifted slowly through the clouds above the Capitol, while the shadow of its hull rolled silently across the city below, like the passing of an eclipse. At 4:17 in the afternoon, the first Dominion Defense Fleet attempted to break formation above the eastern orbital ring. The maneuver lasted exactly 43 seconds before every engine aboard the fleet shut down simultaneously. Across Ethon Prime, civilians watched in stunned silence as 12 Dominion warships drifted powerless through the upper atmosphere like disabled statues suspended against the clouds. No explosions followed. No retaliation. The Terran fleet did not even reposition. Somewhere inside their silent network, humanity had simply decided the matter was over. Inside the Senate chamber, panic finally replaced denial. Military officers shouted over one another while tactical projections flashed red across the walls. "How are they inside our systems?" one admiral demanded. Those ships were disconnected from Central Command. Their targeting grids were overwritten remotely. Another officer answered with visible disbelief. "We cannot even regain manual control." Counselor Varen slammed one trembling hand against the podium hard enough to silence the room. "Enough," he said hoarsely. The chamber fell quiet immediately. Lyra stood near the rear station, watching fear spread openly now across faces that had spent entire careers believing the Dominion could not be challenged. What frightened them was not the Terran fleet itself anymore. It was the realization that humanity had studied them carefully for 22 years while remaining completely unseen. Every weakness, every dependency, every assumption. Human beings who once struggled to survive inside freezing stations had somehow learned how to dismantle an empire without firing a single shot. A communications officer suddenly looked up from her console with wide eyes. "Incoming transmission from the Vigilance," she whispered. "Priority direct." The main chamber screens activated instantly. Adrian Cross appeared once again beneath the cold blue lights of the Terran command bridge. This time the camera stood farther back, revealing more of the officers around him. Lyra noticed something strange immediately. Most of the humans on the bridge looked older than expected. Gray hair, scarred faces, tired eyes. Very few appeared young. This was not a civilization built by people who had lived comfortably. Adrian looked directly into the chamber. 3 hours ago," he said calmly, Dominion Fleet Command attempted unauthorized weapons activation above a civilian capital. His tone never changed. We disabled the fleet. One of the admirals stepped forward angrily. You are humiliating us. Adrian studied him for a long moment before answering. No, he said quietly. Your government accomplished that long before we arrived. The chamber fell silent again. Behind Adrian, one of the Terran officers handed him a thin data tablet. Adrian glanced down briefly before continuing. At this moment, Terran forces have secured 72% of Dominion Gate infrastructure and 91% of military communications networks. He spoke the numbers without pride, without triumph, like a physician reading medical results to a terminal patient. There will be no war today unless your leadership forces one. Lyra realized suddenly that he meant it. Humanity truly did not want open conflict. That was what made them terrifying now. They no longer needed emotional satisfaction. They no longer needed revenge to feel victorious. They had already won the moment they arrived. What exactly do you intend to do with the Dominion? Counselor Varen asked quietly. Adrian remained silent for several seconds before answering. We intend to make certain no civilization is ever abandoned the way ours was. Another silence settled over the chamber. Outside the massive windows behind the council ring, rain continued falling across the capital while dark Terran ships drifted motionless above the skyline. Adrian's expression softened slightly for the first time since the broadcast began. Not warmth exactly, something closer to sadness. 22 years ago, he said, millions of our people died believing help was coming. Lyra felt the room itself grow colder around her. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. The worst part was not the fear, he said softly. It was the waiting. Nobody in the Senate chamber moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Adrian looked back toward the camera one final time. Tomorrow morning, he said, the surviving members of the Wartime Council will surrender themselves into Terran custody. A faint vibration rolled through the tower windows as another enormous human carrier descended slowly through the clouds over Ethon Prime. Or, Adrian finished quietly, the galaxy will learn every remaining secret your government buried with us. Then the transmission ended. The surrender deadline arrived beneath a gray morning sky heavy with rain clouds and silence. Ethon Prime no longer sounded like the capital of a galactic superpower. The endless traffic noise had faded. Military patrols moved quietly through nearly empty streets. Shops remained closed beneath darkened signs, while civilians gathered in small clusters around public screens, waiting for whatever came next. Above them, the Terran fleet still hung motionless across the atmosphere like a second layer of sky. Lyra had not slept in almost 30 hours. She stood near the eastern observation balcony outside the Senate chamber with a cup of untouched coffee cooling slowly between her hands while emergency broadcasts echoed faintly from nearby hallways. Somewhere deep below the tower, protesters had gathered overnight demanding the release of all remaining wartime archives. Others demanded the council resign immediately. For the first time in modern Dominion history, the government no longer controlled the emotional direction of its own people. Humanity did. The chamber doors opened behind Lyra with sharp metallic force. Voices erupted instantly inside. Angry, panicked. She turned just in time to see two senior counselors storming toward the central podium while security officers followed several steps behind. We cannot surrender our government to a dead species, one minister snapped furiously. If we hand over council members now, the Dominion collapses. The Dominion is already collapsing, another answered. Look outside. No one argued with that, because everyone had looked outside already. Terran controls spread wider every hour. Trade systems rerouted through human oversight. Military fleets disabled remotely before they could mobilize. Entire colonial governors publicly declaring neutrality rather than risk confrontation with humanity. The Dominion was not being invaded. It was being quietly replaced. Counselor Varen entered the chamber last. He looked 20 years older than he had 3 days earlier. Lyra noticed immediately that he carried no data tablets this time. No reports. No advisors followed behind him either. Just silence. He stepped slowly toward the center podium, while ministers continued arguing around him like frightened passengers inside a failing ship. Then he raised one hand. The chamber fell quiet almost instantly. "The Terrans have released another archive," he said softly. No one moved. "What archive?" someone whispered. Varen looked toward the tactical screens without answering directly. A moment later, the chamber walls illuminated with a new recording stamped classified, level obsidian. The footage quality was poor. Emergency backup cameras. The timestamp read 6 hours after the Vega withdrawal. A damaged Terran civilian carrier drifted through darkness beneath failing power. Lights flickered weakly across crowded hallways lined with exhausted families wrapped in blankets. Children slept against corridor walls while volunteers distributed ration bars and water packets from emptying containers. Lyra felt cold immediately. She understood at once why Adrian Cross had waited until now to release this file. A voice crackled through the old recording. "This is Carrier Solace, requesting immediate humanitarian extraction. We have over 4,000 civilians aboard, including 600 children." Silence answered the request. Then another transmission entered the feed. Dominion Command Authorization. Calm. Official. Emotionless. Terran civilian vessels are ordered to remain in holding pattern until military withdrawal operations are complete. The carrier captain's voice shook slightly when he answered. "Our oxygen systems are failing." Another pause. Then a response that changed the room forever. "Dominion priority assets take precedence." The recording continued another 2 minutes. Long enough for frightened parents to realize nobody was coming. Long enough for the atmosphere aboard the carrier to shift from hope into understanding. No panic followed. No screaming. That was the part Lyra would remember most. Human volunteers simply continued moving through the corridors, handing blankets to children and speaking softly to frightened families while emergency lights dimmed lower and lower around them. Then the footage ended. Complete silence filled the Senate chamber afterward. One of the ministers quietly removed his council insignia and placed it on the table in front of him. Another covered her face with trembling hands. Counselor Varen stood motionless at the podium, staring down at the darkened screens. "How many more recordings exist?" someone finally whispered. Varen answered without looking up. "Enough to destroy us completely." At that exact moment, the chamber windows trembled softly as one of the giant Terran carriers descended lower through the storm clouds above the capital. The ship moved slowly enough to feel deliberate, respectful almost, like humanity was giving the Dominion one final chance to decide what kind of civilization it wanted to be remembered as before the rest of the truth arrived. The surrender occurred at 8:42 the following morning beneath clear skies for the first time since the Terran fleet arrived. Rain clouds had finally broken apart during the night, leaving pale sunlight spilling across the towers of Ethon Prime, while millions of civilians filled the streets below in complete silence. No one had ordered them there. They simply came. Families stood shoulder to shoulder across plazas and transit platforms, staring upward at the enormous human ships hanging above the capital like silent mountains of steel. For 3 days, the galaxy had waited for war. Instead, it witnessed something far stranger. Accountability. Lyra stood near the Eastern Senate balcony, wearing the same uniform she had slept in the night before, while Dominion security officers lined the chamber entrance behind her. None of them carried weapons anymore. At exactly 8:40, the massive chamber doors opened slowly, and the surviving members of the Wartime Council entered together beneath the cold silver lights. Older now, smaller somehow. The people who had once decided the fate of entire star systems walked quietly toward the center podium, while every camera in the galaxy watched. Counselor Varen led them personally. His hands trembled faintly at his sides, but his posture remained upright. Around the chamber, no one spoke. No one tried to stop them. The tactical screens above the council ring activated automatically. Adrian Cross appeared once more from the bridge of the Vigilance, standing beneath the same cold blue lights that now felt strangely familiar to the entire galaxy. He looked exhausted, more exhausted than triumphant. Behind him, Terran officers worked silently at their stations while the dark curve of Ethon Prime turned slowly beyond the observation glass. Varen stopped at the center podium and lifted his eyes toward the screen. "The Dominion accepts responsibility," he said quietly. The words echoed through the chamber like something physically heavy finally being set down after 22 years. "We surrender all surviving members of the Wartime Council into Terran custody under the conditions previously transmitted." No cheering followed. No dramatic reaction. Across the capital city below, civilians simply listened in silence while sunlight reflected softly across the hulls of the Terran fleet overhead. Adrian Cross studied the chamber for several long seconds before answering. "Acknowledged." His voice remained calm. "Terran forces will assume temporary oversight of Dominion gate systems and military infrastructure effective immediately." On the tactical displays surrounding the chamber, hundreds of system markers shifted color simultaneously as Terran control expanded peacefully across the network. Trade lanes, orbital defenses, communications arrays. Humanity took control of the systems that once controlled them. Yet not a single shot had been fired. Lyra realized then that this was the true victory Adrian Cross had spent 22 years building toward. Not destruction, not revenge, certainty. Humanity would never again depend on the mercy of people willing to abandon them. One of the older ministers lowered himself slowly into his seat and covered his face with both hands. Another simply stared out the towering windows toward the Terran carriers drifting above the city skyline. The age of the Dominion had not ended in fire. It ended in exposure. Adrian stepped slightly closer to the camera. For the first time since the broadcast began, something in his expression softened visibly. Sadness, perhaps, or relief. 22 years ago, he said quietly, millions of Terran civilians died believing the galaxy had forgotten them. Across the capital, nobody moved. We survived long enough to prove they were wrong. Lyra felt her throat tighten unexpectedly while sunlight spread across the chamber floor beneath the massive windows. Outside, civilian transports had already begun moving again beneath Terran escort formations. Shops reopened slowly along the lower districts. Children pointed upward at the enormous human ships crossing peacefully above the city. Life continued. Different now, but continuing. Adrian folded his hands behind his back one final time. "The Dominion betrayed us during war," he said softly. "So we took from them the one thing they never deserved to keep." He paused briefly while the silent Terran fleet filled the skies above Ethon Prime like the future itself arriving all at once. Control. Then the transmission ended. And for the first time in galactic history, humanity stopped asking permission to survive.